I really like building computers. At some point though, this build process took a little bit of a turn. So off to my right is a Fractal Design Meshify 2 XL case. Now, this doesn't look like any other Meshify 2 XL case because this one's been modified. It's my first foray into modding, more specifically spray painting, and for the most part it came out pretty good. There are some rough spots here and there, and if you really look close you can see some of the blemishes, but this case from afar looks pretty good. I'm pretty happy with my first attempt at doing this. This build originally was conceived in my head last fall when rumors of the 5000 series were coming to fruition, of the AMD 5000 series processors, and the NVIDIA RTX 3000 series graphics cards were coming out. Obviously, things changed, and I'm not able to go the upgrade path that I want to for financial, health, and other reasons. We all know about the GPU stock issue. So thankfully, my GTX 1080 Ti is still in pretty good condition and is still performing at a high level. Obviously, NVIDIA made that card too good, but that's okay. That's a benefit to me. My system changes also had to be put on hold. Due to some circumstances that fell in my favor, I was able to come into possession of an X570 motherboard. It's the ASUS ROG Strix Gaming F, and picked up an AMD Ryzen 3900X. Now, it isn't the motherboard or the CPU combo that I wanted. I really wanted a 5900X, and I wanted either a Crosshair Formula or Hero Dark. But again, circumstances kind of didn't work out that way. Most of what you're going to see in this build is really carrying over from my last build. The boot drive is different. That is an ADATA XPG drive. It's NVMe M.2. It's Gen 3, it's PCI Express Gen 3, so it's not Gen 4, but it's still going to be plenty fast for when I'm doing it. All the other drives are carrying over. Graphics card is carrying over. The memory, the Trident Z RGB 3600 megahertz kit, that's at 32 gigabytes. That's carrying over as well. And the power supply is the same, just making a change to the cables, the cable mod cables, going with, you can kind of see it hanging out. No, you can't. They're black, mostly black and white with a little bit of carbon in them. And the real thing that happened here was the decision to make the interior of this case white. Now, this was the real reason that this whole project even started in the first place. This really evolved to a point because I saw the color of paint that Kylie, my daughter, was looking at for her case, and I ended up liking this blue that you see here a lot, and ultimately decided to not just paint the interior, but also paint the exterior. Now, some of these pieces, like this plastic panel back in the back of the motherboard tray, that is the color that her case is going to be on the exterior. So I sprinkled in a little bit of that into it just to kind of spice things up. But really, I saw how much the white interior helped on the P500A brighten up the RGB, and that just made a lot of sense to me. All in all, I'm pretty happy with how the case has come out. It is a little scuffed up for me doing some of the mock-ups to try and figure out where things are going to go, but most of that is in places that aren't visible, so it really doesn't matter. And it was a really good learning experience. It's one of those things I had to do it to kind of get an idea of what was going to happen. But I think we're pretty much ready to just get into this. We're going to get the motherboard installed, going to get all the components installed, and start getting the water cooling configured. And then once I get it started with the leak testing, we'll start worrying about what should be pretty easy cable management. Again, I'm using all Uni fans, 3 in the top, 3 in the front, 1 in the rear, and then I've got 2 Fractal fans in the bottom, and those are just meant to provide a little bit of underglow. And also, one of them provides a mounting point for the pump res. So the pump res is carrying over as well. That's the Quantum Kinetic EK. The pump res is also carrying over. That is the EK Quantum Kinetic TBE 300. Now that I've got the pump cleaned out, it's all been flushed. All the radiators have been flushed. Everything has been checked out. There's no gunk or any sort. And if you watched my teardown video of the M719 build with the 8700K, I was pleasantly surprised that after about 6 months of use, the EK Mystic Fog fluid did not really do a whole lot of gunking up. There was a little bit on the CPU block that really just brushed away. It wasn't all that bad, and considering what I've seen some solid and colored fluids do to people's systems, I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. The other thing that has changed is the GPU block. is now an RGB plexi. So I've moved on from the nickel and acetal without RGB. And that was really more or less because I had the extra RGB header on the motherboard. So there is a look at the clear block installed on the graphics card. And then I went ahead and actually painted the back plate as well to kind of match what was going on. And I'm really happy with how that turned out. I really wanted to have the different colors of the build represented here, plus still get some RGB reflectivity off of it. I think we've succeeded. We have EK parts again for the water cooling. We're soft tubing it again because soft tubing is just easier to deal with, especially if something goes sideways. Same pump res as before, just inside of this, the Fractal Design Meshify 2 XL. If you missed the video I did on the Meshify 2, I'll link to it in the description below and in a card up above. The basic difference between the XL and the Meshify standard Meshify 2 is size and hard drive capacity. The XL comes with an additional hard drive cage in the bottom. Those have all been removed. I just have the fans in the bottom and where the power supply will be. But there is a mounting point in the back of this case for mechanical drives. I'm going to put the one drive there. We're going to be using the Lian Li control box, and for the Fantech stuff, I'm going to be using their digital controller with the remote coming out of somewhere. I'll figure out a place to route it. So let's just get on to the build now. I won't be talking during the actual build, so there won't be anything there other than the footage of it. But if I come across something that I see that seems pertinent, I'll stop and actually talk about it at that point. So see you when I get to the next point. All right, so the build is complete, and it's actually been about a week really since the system was built. I ultimately decided that I wanted to wait until things were up and running and everything was going as I expected before I did a final, this is how it went kind of part to this build. All in all, it really wasn't all that difficult. The biggest thing I would say is, even though I had everything kind of pre-planned out with the water cooling, there still ended up being a couple of pieces I had to recut, and I ultimately made a couple of changes. The one major change I ended up making was with the front radiator. I ultimately decided to go ahead and change that to a 45-degree angle fitting. In the end, the tube coming straight out looked okay, but it was putting a little more strain on the pump res than I really wanted. The 45 doesn't look as good, but I think structurally it's a little more sound and is a little less stress on the fittings, particularly since, we're talking about going into a plexi top on the pump res combo. The blocks, they look great. You can see the system behind me in the shot running at its current color scheme, and I'm really, really happy with that aspect of the build. It's not for everybody. I know there are plenty of people who like the more subdued look of the black interiors, but for me, the white interior with the different accent pieces really just suits it very well, and I'm really pleased with how that turned out. I don't know, it just took a little bit of time. I really just took my time with it, really from the start of this build to the very end. I didn't rush through anything. The leak testing part was fine. There were no leaks anywhere, and the system has been running, like I said, for about a week now, and there's nothing really major going on there. You might notice that there's something in there at the bottom. I have 2 capture cards in there right now, and I'm taking full advantage of the fact that the AMD Ryzen CPUs have 24 PCI Express lanes. Obviously, with the graphics card, the graphics card gets shaved down to 8 lanes if anything's in a second PCI Express slot regardless. So I wanted to play some games, and I was able to get some games loaded up, and everything is running at the frame rates that I would have expected. About 100 to 120 FPS in Destiny 2 at 3440 by 1440p. That's about what it was running at before, but nothing I've done has shown any kind of issue. When I did some actual testing on the NVMe drives, they were running at the speeds that they were supposed to run at. So near as I can tell, all of that is running perfectly. The last thing I wanted to do was put it through a render test because, again, one of the big reasons I went through this upgrade, not just for streaming, but for video editing. The 3900X I knew was going to do well in streaming, and it did. I did a test stream, and OBS barely flinched while I was using the 264 encoder, which is what I typically use when I'm streaming. I know NVENC is there and everything, but the CPU can handle it just fine. Medium encoder settings. Didn't blink once during that entire stream. It was up for about 2 hours. I do still need to stream some games, but I am anticipating no issues there because, again, this thing ran perfectly fine in a normal stream setting. Games will add a little bit to the CPU percentage, but again, I haven't seen anything that makes it really stress itself. In fact, the hardest workload outside of Cinebench that this system has seen is Adobe Premiere Pro, which surprisingly leveraged much more of the threads than I actually was expecting. One of the things I had always noticed about it with my 8700K was that it never really felt like it was really pushing. Now, hardware acceleration being on meant the GPU was picking up a lot of the load, but I was always interested in when I would look at Task Manager and look at the CPU usage and see it just not really doing as much as I would have expected it to do. But with the 3900X, it leveraged many more threads than I was anticipating and was pushing the system pretty good, but it also put a 21-minute video down to a render time of about 15 minutes, and that included about 8 minutes worth of time-lapsing that it had to account for. So I was really happy with that result. I was always kind of a one-for-one with the 8700K. 20 minutes would render in 20 minutes. But to see something with a little bit of something intensive going on finish with a faster time than the video length itself really bodes well for me. I need to do a couple more videos just to get an idea of what happens, particularly if warp stabilization is thrown into the mix. I don't do a whole lot of intense stuff with Premiere Pro, but I do tend to tweak things a little bit. I'm probably not going to apply an actual overclock to this CPU. The reality is that AMD Ryzen doesn't typically get above 4.3, 4.4 gigahertz. If I'm getting an individual core up to 4.6, there's really not a whole lot of reason to try and go for an all-core. I'll just be gimping the performance in the long run, and PBO with a little bit of undervolting seems to be doing the job. So not really much of a need to do that. I will play with it because I do like messing with it, and I will continue to tweak until I find that there's nothing left to mess around with. The neon RGB strips and the other LED strips that are in there are all going to the Phanteks digital RGB controller, which is mounted in the back. Just ended up being the easiest solution for those products. The controller is actually sitting on top of the power supply shroud in between the rear of the case and the last and an SSD. So it's very discreetly put in there. I can just literally pop the glass open and just make the changes to the color as I see fit. There are two Fractal Design Prisma fans in the bottom. Those are on the Fractal Design remote that is tucked into the bottom of the case as well. I can just open the front mesh on the Meshify 2 to get into that remote to make any changes I want there. For those who are wondering though, the Lian Li fans have not given me any issue. I know there have been some reports, some people who have complained that when they start their system up, they don't retain the last settings. That is not something I've experienced. The color cycle that they are set to right now is how they start every time the system starts up. Really nothing to report. I haven't had any USB issues, although I am tapped out on USB ports. I literally am using every single USB port on the back aside from the BIOS flashback one. I'm trying to leave that one open just in case something catastrophic happens. But the Type-C ports both on the back of the motherboard and in the front of the case work. The front USB ports work. Everything is functional. So beyond that, that's going to do it. Let me know what your thoughts are on the build. I know for people who dislike RGB, it's a bit much to look at, but I personally enjoy it. I like the ability to change the look and feel of my build at any point. Some might argue that the blue accents inside of the case make it a little more difficult to do that. I say it's never stopped me before. So I don't know if there are going to be any more videos on this. Maybe something on attempted overclocks and just kind of the performance of the find. I will be working on some other stuff though, so stay tuned for that, and I'll see you guys in the next one.